Hello, this is From the Fireside by Ralph Brandt. Today I'm going to read a chapter from the book Christy, Injured in Space. It's a novel I wrote a few years ago about a young astronaut. The first chapter is called Liftoff. Christy Shank looked around the cabin of the shuttle Enterprise like a starry-eyed schoolgirl on her first date. Through her headset, the 26-year-old mission specialist listened to the count. T-minus 40 and counting. Close the visors and pressurize the suit. This point in the count was an important one to Christy. She finally had something to do for the first time in almost an hour. Up till now, it was just sit and watch. They were now past the point of the T-minus 50 planned hold. Unless something bad happened, they were going up. During the ascent and landing phases of the flight, mission specialists were just passengers. The T-minus 40 count was the signal for Christy to reach up, close the visor on her helmet, and press a button on the console that pressurized her suit enough to verify its integrity. There was no verbal roll call to determine that this was done. Automatic instruments checked the increase in her suit pressure, checked that it held the pressure, and noted that to the computer. It recorded that Christy had hit the button at 3.4761 seconds and the suit inflated properly. This event was logged on the board and telemetry sent that information to the ground. If something went wrong, like on Challenger, these logs would be the critical items for the team that would investigate the incident. The computer now started monitoring the suit pressure. If it fell, there would be an alarm that would bring about checking and possibly a scrub of the mission if it could not be resolved. The computer passed the all clear to the ground computer 2 minutes after the commander pressed the button. He was busy and it took him 16 seconds to accomplish the task. The 2-minute lag before the all clear allowed the sensors to detect a leak. Even so, the time was well within the nominal report deadline of 35:43:0000. The reporting would continue every minute until launch. The cargo bay contained the heaviest load any shuttle had ever carried. It was a new module for the space station. The public manifest simply called it an expanded research bay. Like the Tokyo-bound B-29 bombers of World War II, the shuttle had been stripped of everything but essentials for this mission. The crew was down to 5, including the passengers, not the usual 7 or 8. There was no scientific work scheduled. The flight was to deliver a new module to the station, assist in placing the module, and returning, nothing more. It seemed like every precaution had been taken. The commander and the pilot were veterans. In the left seat, Jack Keener was making his 6th flight, one more than Jen Walters in the right seat. There was only one flight engineer, not the usual 2. Although she was less experienced than some of the other FEs, she was well versed in the shuttle systems and had exceptional simulator scores on failures. Although the weight of a person was less than 200 pounds, without the person on board, a 300-pound seat, a suit, and a host of other items could be removed from the manifest. If you had 3 less people, you needed 3 less of a lot of things and a lot less consumables. Even the oxygen supply had weight. When you totaled up the person, seat, breathing gear, life support, and miscellaneous, 3 people could cost well over 5,000 pounds. Food stocks were also at a minimum, as were most of the other consumables, including fuel for the maneuvering rockets and the APUs to even further lighten the load. No previous shuttle had taken off with the rocket and APU fuel stocks below 100%. Enterprise was leaving with them at 50%. They were planning a very short mission. Even with this, the shuttle was a full 500 pounds heavier than it had ever been before at liftoff. There were small safety margins, but they were perilously thin. This concerned both Jack and Jen more than either of them would admit. If there was a prime enemy of orbital flight, it was weight. And both knew that if someone forgot to take off some items, overfilled a tank, or miscalculated some value, they could fail to achieve orbit. They knew each other well, had flown 3 flights together, and trusted the other's abilities. But no pilot, no matter how good, could change the laws of physics. If they were too heavy, the fuel would burn up, and they would not have enough energy to stay in orbit. And the pilots knew that to avoid a crash, they would have to milk out every mile of glide with the airframe that had the glide characteristics only slightly better than a rock. There was the old pilot saying, "The things that are of no value are altitude above you, airspeed you burned off, and fuel you have already burned." This flight was going to be done with white knuckles, conserving every resource and watching gauges. The count continued, and finally, 3, 2, 1. The main engines lit. Christy could feel the vibration. The shuttle strained to lift off, held on the pad by the enormous clamps and the weight of the vehicle. The 3 powerful main engines, among the most powerful rocket engines ever built, had only a fraction of the thrust needed to lift the shuttle off the pad. But unless they created their full thrust, the shuttle could not achieve orbit. The bird needed massive thrust to lift it. This was the final test of the rocket engines. They were firing, but to reach orbit they must deliver. Failure to reach orbit likely meant the loss of the shuttle, the space station module, and almost certainly the crew. The only way to be sure the engines were operating right was to let them throttle up. On one flight, one engine had failed late in the ascent, and the shuttle had achieved orbit, but the payload was much lighter, and they let the other 2 engines burn the remaining fuel to do it. It was called abort to orbit, but because of the mechanics, they were able to reach orbit. At that point in the flight, the thrust of 2 engines firing longer was enough to give the vehicle the needed velocity. The main engines must power up before the solid rocket boosters, or SRBs, could be lit. Once they are lit, they can't be unlit. The computer received the appropriate signals, and the computer signaled the igniters to light the SRBs. These 2 large solid-fueled rockets were much like 4th of July rockets. Unlike the main engines that could be turned on and off or throttled up and down, the SRBs were lit, and they burned at their only thrust setting, 100%, till they exhausted their solid fuel. The main engines could be throttled, shut down, and restarted. They could also be steered. The word used by the rocket scientists was gimbaled. Their thrust was also used to adjust for any non-balance of the main engines or the SRBs. With the SRBs lit, the explosive bolts in the clamps holding the vehicle on the ground were fired. The combined thrust of the main engines and the SRBs exceeded the weight of the vehicle, and the shuttle was on its way. At first the movement was slow, but as the fuel and oxidizer in the main tanks was expended and the solid fuel in the SRBs burned, the weight of the vehicle fell rapidly while the thrust remained constant and the acceleration increased. They passed the point of max Q and prepared for the throttle up of the main engines. Everyone involved with the shuttle knew this point all too well. Christy had seen the video many times since the first time she saw it, just after her 15th birthday. It happened before she was born, but she could picture it, the explosion, the SRB separation, and Challenger disappearing in the smoke. And it all happened because a plastic O-ring was too cold to seal properly. The zinc oxide paste that was to protect it from the heat blew out, the ring burned through, the jet of hot gas hit the fuel tank, and it exploded. Christy remembered the old saying, "Because of the nail, the shoe was lost. Because of the shoe, the horse was lost. Because of the horse, the rider was lost. Because of the rider, the battle was lost." The shuttle was a fabulous machine, but it was also a terrible and unforgiving one. It was pushing the limits of many of the components. Christy remembered that these components were each built by the lowest bidder. Because of an O-ring, the Challenger was lost. She wondered if there was another fatal flaw in the Enterprise. Through the headset she heard the message, "You're a go for orbit." They were on their way. Up to this time they could still abort to a landing, albeit a difficult and very risky one. but at some point the speed and altitude of the shuttle made an abort to Earth impossible. She looked over at the second mission specialist, Don Engel. He gave a thumbs up. She smiled back. As she did, she heard a thump. Several alarms went off at the same time. The flight engineer was immediately on the headset with a calm message. "Kennedy, we have had an event." Christy wondered if this is what it was like in Challenger that day. Were they reliving an awful experience? This is the end of the first chapter of Christy. This is Ralph Brandt from the Fireside.